They left him for dead, a Marine chained to cold steel, a newborn beside him, the thunder of a freight train racing near. He had no weapon, no allies, no time. But hope came in the smallest form, a little girl with tangled hair and a German shepherd whose instincts would not fail. That night, the tracks became a battlefield, and the story of survival began.
Get you out of there.
What followed was a war against a ruthless ring that preyed on the helpless. If you believe loyalty and courage still matter, press like, subscribe, and stay with us. The night pressed heavy over Denver's industrial edge, a sky the color of ash stretching above warehouses and rusted fences. Jack Turner walked alone down a deserted service road, his boots crunching over broken glass and gravel. His frame carried the squared shoulders of a Marine, the weight of deployment still visible in the set of his jaw, and the quiet caution of a man who had learned to listen to every sound in the dark. He had followed whispers of missing children, hear rumors of vans that never returned, of crying heard behind locked doors. What he didn't know was that the hunt had already turned on him. Jack paused near the tracks, crouching low, his flashlight beam scanning the frost-glazed steel. He had always trusted his instincts, and tonight they whispered danger. A loose sheet of corrugated metal clanged in the distance, carried by the wind, but he noticed something sharper, a faint echo of footsteps that didn't belong to him. He straightened slowly, his hand hovering near the knife strapped inside his jacket. But the attack came too fast. From the shadows, 3 men emerged, their movements swift and deliberate. Jack fought back with the reflexes of his training, landing a hard elbow into one man's ribs, sending another staggering with a sharp punch. But the third struck from behind a chain, whipping across his shoulders, the weight dragging him to the ground. Boots thundered against his ribs, and fists hammered until his breath broke into ragged gasps. Still, Jack resisted. Every strike, every attempt to pin him only awakened the Marine in him. He rolled, swinging low, his knuckles splitting skin, but the odds pressed harder. A hood dropped over his head, muffling his vision. A blow to his side left his ears ringing. Then a voice leaned close, calm and cruel. "You should have stayed out of this, Marine. You weren't invited." Jack gritted his teeth. He had heard voices like this before in alleys overseas, in ambushes where men spoke with certainty that he would not live to see another dawn. But he had lived always, and yet here on American soil he felt the cold hand of betrayal. The hood was yanked away, the world spinning into clarity again. The men dragged him toward the steel rails. His arms were forced behind his back, iron cuffs biting into his wrists. They chained him to the tracks like discarded freight, his back pressed against cold metal, his breath fogging in the night air. Blood trickled from his brow, blurring his sight, but he could make out the shapes of his captors standing above him. Their faces half hidden by caps and scarves, their eyes hard and unyielding. "You like to ask questions, Turner," the leader sneered. "Well, here's your answer. No one comes this way at night. No one will hear you." Jack shifted against the iron restraints, his muscles straining, the steel biting deeper. He knew this kind of tactic not just to kill, but to humiliate, to erase. A soldier dying under enemy fire was one thing. A Marine left to be crushed by a freight train in his own city was another. It sent a message. From far off, the long moan of a train horn drifted across the rails, a sound that once carried commerce and progress, but now carried death. The vibration trembled faintly beneath him, distant but growing. Jack closed his eyes briefly, not in surrender but in calculation. His ribs ached, his breathing ragged, but he focused on every detail. The cuffs were old, not standard issue. The chain links carried rust. There might be a chance if time allowed, but time would not allow. The men didn't linger. Their work was done. They vanished back into the dark boots, fading into silence, leaving Jack with nothing but the cold rails beneath him and the echo of his own breath. He tested the chain again, the bite of steel cutting deeper into his skin. Pain radiated down his arms, but pain was familiar. Pain meant he was still alive. He shifted his legs, searching for leverage, but the cuffs had been secured with precision. Whoever set this trap knew exactly how to keep a Marine from breaking free. The ground shivered harder now. The horn wailed closer, a scream of steel echoing through the night. Jack clenched his jaw, his thoughts darting not to himself but to the images that had driven him here, the photographs of missing children pinned to bulletin boards, the voices of mothers who begged for someone, anyone, to listen. If this was the end, it was too soon. He had come too close to letting the truth slip through his fingers. The rails vibrated in rhythm with the pounding of his heart. His chest rose and fell in sharp, deliberate breaths, not of panic but of defiance. He refused to let fear take the final word. Somewhere out there, a van was carrying children who deserved more than silence. Somewhere out there, justice had not yet been served. As the light of the approaching train carved a white wound into the night, Jack braced himself not in surrender, but in the resolve that even if death claimed him here, it would not claim him easily. His eyes narrowed, locking on the distant beam as it cut through the dark, a reminder that every battle was fought not for oneself but for those who could not fight. The rumble of the approaching train grew heavier, its horn cutting the night like a warning from steel itself. And Jack Turner knew he had only moments left yet. In that same moment, fate was already shifting. From the other side of the service road, the sound of hurried footsteps crunched over frost and gravel, lighter, quicker than those of grown men. A dog barked once sharp and alert, then another set of steps followed, smaller and uneven, the pattern of a child's shoes slapping the ground. The sound of chains scraping against the rails had carried through the cold air and had drawn them here, a call neither could ignore. Emily Parker, 10 years old with hair falling in messy brown strands over her pale face, stopped short when her eyes caught the gleam of metal and the figure bound across the tracks. Her breath froze in her chest, fear tightening her small frame, but her gaze did not turn away. At her side, Duke, a German shepherd with a thick black and tan coat and a scar notched in one ear, stood rigid ears, pricked nose low, reading the danger in the air. The train horn blasted again, closer, louder, and Emily's heart hammered as she took a cautious step forward. Jack twisted his neck, his swollen face turning toward the sound, and what he saw nearly stole his breath, more than the chains a child slight and trembling, but not running away. "Get back!" he shouted hoarsely, his voice breaking against the roar of steel behind him. Yet Emily did not move back. She gripped the straps of her worn backpack as if it might steady her, then whispered to Duke, "It's him, the man we heard." The dog growled low, circling once before stepping closer to Jack's restrained frame, his nose brushing the iron cuffs, his body tense as though he understood the stakes. Emily's instincts told her she should be afraid, but another voice deeper inside told her something else. This man was not her enemy. She saw the battered face, the uniform jacket torn at the seams, the steady eyes that even in pain carried a strength she had never seen in the faces of those who hurt her world. The ground trembled harder. The train's headlight carved a beam across the distant bend, growing brighter with every second. Jack forced words out through his breathless lungs. "There's a latch left. Cuff, pull it up now." Emily dropped to her knees beside him, her small fingers fumbling across cold steel slick with blood. She could hear the rails singing, the vibration traveling into her bones, but she clenched her jaw and forced her hands not to shake. Duke barked sharply, his tail stiff, his body pressing against Emily's side like an anchor. She bit her lip hard enough to taste copper and dragged her nail across the groove. "Come on!" she whispered, her voice thin but steady. The first latch clicked, releasing Jack's left wrist, and pain tore through his arm as he yanked it forward. The other one, he barked, his voice harsh, not in anger, but in urgency. Emily reached across, scraping her skin raw against the groove as the train thundered nearer its horn, screaming so loud it drowned every other sound. She gasped, terror rising, but Duke barked again, sharp and commanding, as though telling her to finish. Her fingers slipped once, then caught, and the latch sprang free. Jack rolled with all the force he had left, his body slamming against the gravel, dragging himself off the rails. He threw his weight over Emily, his shoulder tearing in agony as he pulled her and the dog closer to safety. The freight train exploded past a storm of dust, iron, and sound that tore the air from their lungs. Emily clutched Duke's fur eyes squeezed shut while Jack shielded her with his battered frame. The wind from the cars howled over them, rattling loose stones and ripping frost into the air. Then, just as suddenly, silence returned, broken only by the ragged breaths of 3 survivors. Jack lay still for a moment, his chest heaving, then pushed himself upright, his muscles shaking. His eyes went to the girl who knelt before him, still clutching the dog's neck. She was pale, freckles scattered across her cheeks, her pink hoodie torn at the sleeve, her knees bruised, but she had not run. She had not even frozen. She had acted. "You saved me," Jack said hoarsely, his voice a rasp of disbelief. Emily shook her head quickly, pressing her cheek into Duke's fur. "He saved you too. He always knows." Duke wagged his tail, once solemn, his amber eyes locked on Jack as if awaiting orders. Jack touched the raw skin of his wrists where the cuffs had dug in, then looked at the child and the dog who had defied the night. He wanted to tell her to run home to get far away, but something in her eyes stopped him. They were too steady, too aware, the eyes of someone who had already seen more than her share of darkness. The sound of the train faded into distance, leaving only the echo of chains scattered across gravel. Jack reached for the basket he had spotted near the rails, the memory of the mission that had led him here still burning. He lifted it with shaking hands, and though it was empty now, the faint smell of milk still clung to the fabric inside. Someone had been here before him, and someone had planned to silence him before he could find more. Emily glanced at the basket, then back at Jack and whispered, "You were looking for them, weren't you? The kids." Jack met her gaze, and though his lips formed no words, the answer was clear. Duke gave a low growl, not of threat, but of warning ears flicking toward the shadows beyond the service road. The night was not empty. Jack's instincts sharpened again, the Marine in him rising to the surface. He pulled himself to his feet, swaying but steady, and reached out a hand to Emily. She hesitated, then placed her small hand in his. Rising with him, Duke pressed firmly against her side. The train tracks behind them glistened in the frost, silent now, but Jack knew the silence would not last. The ones who chained him here would learn soon enough that he had lived. And because of a child and her dog, he now carried not only the weight of survival, but a renewed promise he would not stop until the missing were found, until the ones who thought they could bury their crimes in the dark were dragged into the light. The echoes of the freight train still hung in the cold night air when Jack Turner tightened his grip on Emily's small hand and led her away from the rails, his body aching with every step, his mind racing faster than his heartbeat. He knew he should have felt relief for being alive, but what filled him instead was a gnawing urgency. The men who had left him to die would soon learn that he had survived, and when they came back, they would not hesitate to harm anyone who stood too close. As they reached the service road, Jack stopped and crouched to Emily's eye level, his breath visible in the frosty air. "You did more than anyone could have asked," he said, his voice rough but steady. "But now you need to go home. Get far away from here before they realize you were part of this." Emily clutched Duke's collar and shook her head firmly, her messy brown hair falling across her face. "I can't go," she whispered, her voice stronger than her trembling hands suggested. Jack narrowed his eyes, surprised by her certainty. "Why not?" he pressed. She swallowed hard, her gaze never leaving his. "Because I know this city. I know the alleys where the trucks stop. I know which buildings they use when they move kids. The police don't listen when someone like me tells them, but you will." The words struck Jack like a sudden current. and for the first time since the chains had been unlocked, he saw not just a child, but someone forged by survival. He wanted to argue to tell her that no 10-year-old belonged in the middle of this storm. Yet he also knew that refusing her meant discarding the one piece of knowledge he desperately needed. Duke shifted beside her. His ears pricked his stance, protective. The dog pressed closer to Emily's side, his chest rising and falling in deep, steady breaths. His amber eyes fixed on Jack with an intensity that left no doubt. Jack recognized that look one he had seen in canine units overseas dogs who chose their person and never abandoned them. Duke had chosen. The realization tightened Jack's chest because it meant he could not send Emily away even if he tried. She would follow and the dog would guard her path. Jack rose again, grimacing as pain lanced through his ribs, and looked down the empty road toward the faint glow of the city's skyline. He weighed his options with the cold precision of a Marine. He could walk into the nearest precinct and file a report, but he already knew what would follow. Endless questions, doubts about a half-conscious veteran found at the tracks, skepticism toward a girl with no guardian and a dog at her side. Time would bleed away in paperwork while children were moved to another hiding place. He could not afford that. Emily pulled lightly on his sleeve, her eyes sharp in the dim light. "They think you're gone, don't they? That means we're ahead of them. If we stay together, maybe we can find them before they hide again." Jack studied her, wondering how a child carried such clear logic. But the answer came quickly. Children who live too long in shadows learn to see what adults ignore. They walked together along the cracked pavement, Duke padding silently beside them, his nose twitching at every scent, his body always slightly ahead as though scouting. Jack asked Emily how she knew about the trucks, and she explained in fragments, her voice quiet but unwavering. She had seen vans stopping near the rail yard at night. She had watched men marking walls with chalk before leading children into warehouses, and she had memorized which alleys smelled of sour milk and bleach, even when no one lived inside. Jack listened, his stomach tightening with every detail. She spoke not with imagination, but with observation sharpened by necessity. The city stretched around them in silence, the warehouses looming like sleeping beasts. Jack knew the danger had doubled the moment Emily tied herself to his fight, yet he also felt something shift inside him. For years he had carried battles alone, convinced that no one could stand beside him in the shadows of his failures. Now, here stood a child and a dog who refused to leave, and against his better judgment, he felt less alone. They reached an abandoned lot where the grass pushed through cracked asphalt, and Jack guided them to a spot behind a rusted fence to catch their breath. He leaned against the chain links, his ribs aching, and said quietly, "If you stay with me, you'll see things no child should ever see. You'll hear things you'll never forget. Once you step in, there's no going back." Emily tightened her grip on Duke's fur and lifted her chin. "I've already seen enough," she answered, her voice steady, her eyes glistening but unflinching. Duke thumped his tail once against the ground as if to underline her words. Jack drew in a long breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. He understood now that sending them away would not protect them. It would only leave them vulnerable in the dark with enemies who had already taken too much. Better to keep them close where he could fight with them at his side. He straightened slowly, pain radiating through his frame, and nodded. "All right. We do this together. But you stay close, you follow my lead, and you trust Duke as much as you trust me." Emily gave a small nod, and Duke pressed against Jack's leg briefly before resuming his watch. Far off, the sound of an engine echoed against the metal siding of the warehouses, followed by the brief flash of headlights cutting across a wall before vanishing again. Jack stiffened every sense on alert. Whoever had chained him to the tracks was still out there moving, planning, perhaps already searching for proof that their work had succeeded. He knew they had little time before the city's shadows swallowed the trail. He turned to Emily and Duke, his voice low but certain. "We move now, before they do." The abandoned lot where Jack Turner and Emily Parker paused for breath was cloaked in silence except for the faint hum of distant engines and the restless shuffle of Duke's paws over gravel. Jack winced as he pulled off his torn jacket, revealing blood seeping through his undershirt where the chain had cut into his shoulder and ribs. Emily knelt beside him without hesitation, her thin hands rummaging through her worn backpack. She produced a roll of gauze, a crumpled alcohol wipe, and a strip of medical tape. Jack raised his brows in surprise. "Where did you get these?" he asked. Emily looked down at the supplies, then up at him with a guarded expression. "I keep them. Sometimes I need them." Her voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. In her short life she had already been forced to patch wounds no child should have known. As she pressed the alcohol to his skin, Jack hissed softly but did not move away. He studied her small, determined face, freckles dusted across her nose, her eyes steady even as her hands trembled from cold and fatigue. "Who taught you this?" he asked gently. Emily kept her eyes on the bandage. "My mom," she said. "She was a nurse." Jack froze for a heartbeat, his body stiffening under her touch. Was he asked carefully? Emily's lips pressed into a tight line before she answered. "They took her. And my dad. Years ago. I was hiding under the table when they came. I never saw them again." The words hung in the night air heavier than the frost. Jack closed his eyes briefly, the truth searing through him. The child beside him was not just a bystander who stumbled into his fight. She was a direct survivor of the same network he had been trying to expose. Her parents had vanished into it, and somehow she had endured the aftermath alone. He opened his eyes, looking at her with new gravity. "Emily," he said, his voice low and steady. "That means they're the same ones I've been hunting. We're chasing the same ghosts." Emily secured the tape over his ribs, then looked up at him with an expression that was both vulnerable and fierce. "Then we have to find them," she whispered. Duke pressed closer, his head nudging Emily's arm, his amber eyes burning with quiet certainty as though he too understood the weight of her words. Jack straightened, rolling his shoulders against the ache, and rose carefully to his feet. He guided Emily and Duke toward the outer streets, the night deepening as they moved through alleys littered with old posters and broken bottles. Jack's mind was astorm not only with the pain of his wounds, but with the realization that every lead was now personal. He could not let her carry this burden alone, yet he knew the only way forward was together. They turned a corner into a narrow alley where the walls were stained with years of soot and graffiti. Emily suddenly stopped tugging lightly at Jack's sleeve. There she whispered, pointing to a faded brick wall. At first, Jack saw nothing but grime and faint chalk scrawls, but when she stepped closer, he noticed the pattern. A triangle marked low near the ground, followed by a pair of slashes and a circle. "It's not random," Emily said firmly. "They leave these for each other. A triangle means a place they've used. Slashes mean it's still active. The circle means it's safe for them." Jack narrowed his eyes, scanning the symbols. "You're sure?" Emily nodded. "Kids like me use marks too, but not like this. This is theirs. I've seen them before." Jack crouched beside the wall, running his calloused fingers across the chalk. It was faint, but recent, not yet washed away by weather. The marks confirmed what he had feared. The men who chained him had roots deeper than one warehouse or one rail yard. They had a system, a network, hidden in plain sight. He rose slowly, looking down the alley. "If we follow these, where do they lead?" "Emily?" Bit her lip, then pointed toward the darker stretch of streets where old factories loomed. "There will be more. They always leave a trail, but only if you know how to see it." Duke sniffed the wall, then turned his head sharply toward the direction Emily indicated, his tail stiff, his body tense. Jack watched the dog's reaction and felt the old surge of trust he once had for canine handlers overseas. Animals sensed what men ignored, and this one was already ahead of them. He placed a steady hand on Emily's shoulder. "All right," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "We'll follow their marks. But you stay close to me, and we move carefully. This isn't a game." Emily met his gaze and gave a small nod. They walked deeper into the city's skeleton, the streets narrowing, the silence thickening. Every so often, Emily stopped scanning walls, crouching low to spot faint chalk symbols near doorways or trash bins. Jack kept watch over her, his Glock heavy at his side, though he knew firing it would draw every ear within blocks. Duke moved ahead in short bursts, circling back with a low growl whenever the air grew sour with the scent of rot and rust. At one point, Emily pointed to a crude symbol scratched into a metal door, a crooked bottle next to a set of arrows. "That means a drop," she explained. "They leave kids here until someone comes." Jack's jaw tightened, rage flickering beneath the discipline in his eyes. The thought of children left like parcels in forgotten corners carved at him, but he forced the fury down. Anger could not guide him now. Precision had to. The deeper they went, the clearer the pattern became. Each symbol led to another like breadcrumbs through the city's forgotten veins. Jack realized they were being invited to follow not by choice, but by arrogance. The network believed no one outside their circle would ever understand the language. But Emily did. And now so did he. The night pressed colder as they reached the edge of another lot, this one with boarded windows and a sagging fence. Emily crouched and pointed again. Another triangle. Another pair of slashes. Jack exhaled slowly, his body taut with anticipation. They were close to something. He didn't know yet if it would be answers or another trap, but either way the path had been drawn. The chalk marks had led them deeper into the city's forgotten edges, where boarded houses leaned like tired sentinels against the night. Jack Turner. His ribs bound tight beneath Emily Parker's bandages, pushed forward with each careful step, his eyes always scanning for movement. Emily walked close, clutching Duke's collar when shadows stretched too long across the pavement. The dog's nose twitched constantly, reading scents hidden from human senses. His ears pricked as though every sound carried weight. When they reached the corner of an alley that stank of mold and rust, Emily pointed to another set of symbols scratched faintly into the base of a door frame. "Here," she whispered, her voice hushed, not by fear, but by certainty. "They've been here. The triangle again, and the slashes are fresh." Jack crouched, running his fingers over the chalk. The marks were recent, not yet dulled by rain or dust. He stood slowly, his jaw set. "We go in, but stay behind me." He pushed the door open with his shoulder, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air hit them like a wave sour milk rust, and something worse, the heavy residue of lives held in captivity. Dust floated in the beam of Jack's flashlight as he swept across the room. At first, the space looked abandoned, but then the details emerged: a crib pushed against the wall with its mattress torn open, a line of small shoes scattered in the corner, a baby bottle crusted with dried formula on the floorboards. Emily's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide. Duke whined low, pressing close to her, as if to shield her from the sight. Jack crouched beside the crib, his calloused hand brushing against the frayed fabric, his chest tightening. The bedding was still warm faintly, which meant whoever had been here had left only hours before. He rose sharply, scanning the room again. "We just missed them," he muttered. Rage flickered under his calm tone, but he swallowed it back. Anger would not help the children. He turned his flashlight toward the hallway and motioned Emily to stay close. They moved carefully, their footsteps creaking against warped boards. In the kitchen, they found dishes stacked in the sink. Milk stains crusted along the edges, proof that infants had been fed here. On the table lay a stack of blankets folded neatly, worn thin from use, one embroidered with a faded daisy. Emily touched it lightly, her lips trembling. "They were real," she whispered, not just whispers. Before Jack could respond, Duke stiffened, his hackles rising as he growled toward a door at the back of the house. Jack lifted a hand to signal stillness, then stepped forward, his Glock raised. He pushed the door open to reveal a dimly lit room where an elderly woman sat on a narrow cot, her frame hunched, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. Her gray hair was tied back in a bun that had mostly unraveled, her wool cardigan draped loosely over thin shoulders. She looked up, her eyes clouded with age and fear. "I knew someone would come," she whispered, her voice cracked and fragile. Jack kept his weapon lowered but ready. "Who are you?" he asked firmly. The woman's lips trembled. "Clara Whitmore," she said. I used to be a nurse." Emily stepped closer, confusion on her face. "What are you doing here?" Clara lowered her gaze, her hands twisting in her lap. "I cared for them," she admitted, tears welling. "The babies they brought. I fed them, wrapped them, held them when they cried." Her voice broke and she pressed a hand to her mouth. "I told myself it was better I was here than someone crueler, that at least I could give them some comfort. But I knew where they went. I knew." Emily's fists clenched at her sides. "Why didn't you stop them?" she asked, her voice sharp with the desperation of a child who had lost too much. Clara shook her head, sobbing softly. "You don't understand. They watch me. Always. If I spoke, if I tried to run, they said they'd silence me too, and I was a coward. I let fear chain me." Jack studied her, his jaw tightening. He recognized the broken tone of someone torn between guilt and survival. He lowered his weapon completely, but kept his eyes locked on her. "If you really want to make this right, then tell me what you know. Where are they moving the children?" Clara's hands shook violently as she reached for the mug on the table, gripping it as if it anchored her. "There's a man," she whispered. "They call him the broker. He decides where they go when they vanish. But the ones here, they left only this morning. A truck came at dawn." Emily gasped, stepping back as if the air had been punched from her. Duke pressed against her legs, his body steady, his presence grounding. Jack's chest ached with the weight of the truth. They were close, but always one step behind. He crouched slightly to meet Clara's gaze. "If you want forgiveness, then stand with us. Help us find them." Clara's tears spilled freely now, her voice breaking. "I want to, but I'm so afraid." Jack was about to respond when Duke growled again, sharper this time, his ears swiveling toward the window. Jack froze, instincts firing. Someone was outside watching. He motioned for silence, then eased toward the cracked blinds. A shadow flickered at the edge of the street before vanishing. The realization settled cold in his chest. The house was not as abandoned as it seemed. Clara Whitmore's frail voice cracked through the silence of the abandoned house, her eyes darting from Jack Turner to Emily Parker, as though the walls themselves might betray her. She gripped the chipped mug tighter, her knuckles white, and whispered, "There is a man who decides everything. They call him the broker. He never touches the children himself, but nothing happens without him. The safe houses, the buyers, the enforcers, they all answer to him." Jack felt the words tighten his chest, the title itself dripping with the weight of control. "Where is he?" Jack asked, his tone low measured. But Clara's shoulders sagged under the question. "I don't know where he lives," she admitted, tears shimmering in her eyes. "But I know his shadow. He has people everywhere. He knows things before they happen, like he sees through the city itself. If I say more, they will end me." Emily stepped closer, her voice trembling but urgent. "But if you stay silent, more children disappear. You said you cared for them. Then help us stop this. Clara looked at the girl, her lips trembling, and for a brief moment her expression softened almost maternal. You sound like the daughter I lost, she whispered, then quickly turned away as if the memory cut too deep. Before Jack could press her further, Duke let out a low growl, the kind that came not from uncertainty, but from absolute warning. His body stiffened, his head snapping toward the window, his ears pricked high. Jack froze, his instincts firing instantly. He moved toward the cracked blinds, easing them apart just enough to glimpse the outside. A shadow shifted near the fence line, then another near the corner of the house. His breath shortened. They weren't alone. Down, Jack hissed, pulling Emily behind him as the first shot cracked through the glass, shattering the silence into chaos. Clara screamed and dropped to the floor, the mug splintering at her feet. Splinters of wood burst from the doorframe as more bullets slammed into the house. Duke barked ferociously, lunging toward the window, his teeth flashing, his bark echoing like thunder against the walls. Jack pressed Emily against the floorboards, covering her small frame with his own, then dragged her toward the back hallway. Stay low. Move when I move, he ordered, his voice steady despite the rain of gunfire. Clara crawled desperately toward them, tears streaking her cheeks. I told you they watch me. They always watch, she cried, her voice almost drowned by the roar of bullets. Jack pulled her arm, forcing her to keep moving. The house shook with the impact of rounds tearing through walls, but Jack's focus remained sharp. He knew they had only moments before the attackers forced their way inside. They reached the back door, Jack pushing it open with his shoulder, the hinges groaning under the strain. The night air hit them cold and sharp, carrying the acrid scent of gunpowder. Duke bolted through, first his body low to the ground, scanning the shadows with practiced precision. Jack shoved Emily through, then Clara, before diving out himself as another volley of shots tore into the frame where they had been seconds earlier. Run! Jack barked, and they sprinted across the lot, their footsteps slapping against the frozen earth. Emily's breaths came in sharp gasps, but she held tight to Duke's fur as he pulled slightly ahead, guiding her like a seasoned protector. Clara stumbled, nearly falling, but Jack caught her arm, dragging her forward. The attackers shouted behind them, their boots pounding as they gave chase. A muzzle flash split the dark, a bullet striking the chain-link fence inches from Emily's head, the sparks briefly illuminating her pale, determined face. Jack pushed them toward the narrow alley between two crumbling warehouses, his body burning with pain, but fueled by sheer will. He spun once, firing his Glock down the open lot, forcing the gunmen to duck for cover. The shots echoed like thunder, giving them precious seconds to vanish into the alley's shadows. They pressed against the damp brick wall, panting the echoes of pursuit still close. Duke's ears flicked constantly, his growl low and steady warning that the hunters had not abandoned the chase. Clara clutched her chest, her frail body trembling. You don't understand, she gasped. They will never stop. The broker doesn't forgive betrayal. Jack's eyes locked on hers, fierce and unyielding. Then don't betray fight. Help us bring him down. Clara shook her head violently, her fear overwhelming, but Emily reached out, placing a small hand on the woman's trembling arm. If you give up now, then every baby you held will stay lost. You can't let fear win. For a moment, Clara's sobs quieted, her eyes locking on Emily's freckled face. Something shifted, but before words could form, another shot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off the wall beside them. Jack swore under his breath, pulling both of them deeper into the alley. They needed distance, a place to regroup, or they would be cut down before the night was done. They emerged onto a side street where flickering street lamps cast fractured light across cracked pavement. Jack scanned quickly, spotting an old storm drain cover partly ajar. There, he said, pulling the heavy grate aside with a grunt. He pushed Emily down first, then Clara, before lowering himself in with Duke, leaping gracefully after. The darkness swallowed them, the sound of boots echoing above as the attackers stormed past, unaware of their escape. In the suffocating silence of the storm tunnel, their breaths echoed shallow and uneven. Jack steadied his Glock ears, straining for any hint of pursuit. Emily clung to Duke, her heartbeat pounding against his steady frame. Clara rocked slightly, her voice faint. "The broker will know. He always knows." Jack fixed his gaze forward, the tunnel stretching like a path into deeper shadows. "Then we find him. First," he said firmly. "And we end this before more vanish." The storm drain carried them 2 blocks beneath the city before Jack Turner lifted the grate and guided Emily Parker Duke and Clara Whitmore back onto the street. The air outside was sharp and cold, tinged with smoke from distant factories. Clara leaned heavily against the brick wall, her face pale, her body shaking from the frantic escape. Jack steadied her but wasted no time. "Where do they move them after the houses?" he asked in a low, urgent tone. Clara closed her eyes briefly, then whispered, "Warehouses near the rail yard. Always near the rail lines. Easier to load them, easier to vanish." Jack's jaw tightened as he recalled the rattling tracks that had nearly taken his life. The network was using the veins of the city to move children like cargo. Emily tugged lightly at his sleeve, her eyes sharp despite her exhaustion. "I know the buildings she means. I've seen trucks go there at night." Jack met her gaze and nodded once. He trusted her instincts now as much as his own. With Duke trotting at their side, they moved quickly, staying in the shadows, slipping between alleys until the faint glow of sodium lamps marked the edge of the rail yard. The warehouse loomed like a steel beast against the night sky, its corrugated walls rusted but solid, its roof patched with dark sheets that gleamed faintly in the pale light. Jack crouched behind a stack of pallets across the street, scanning the building's perimeter. 2 guards with rifles slung across their shoulders paced near the entrance, their movements disciplined, their eyes sweeping the dark. Duke growled softly, the fur along his spine bristling. Jack placed a steadying hand on the dog's back. "Not yet," he whispered. They waited for a break in the guards' patrol, then slipped toward a side door half concealed by stacks of crates. Jack eased the door open, the hinges squealing faintly before he slipped inside with Emily clutching Duke's collar and Clara following with hesitant steps. The smell hit them immediately, sour milk bleach and the faint, unmistakable cries of infants. Emily's breath caught in her throat and Jack felt the weight of the sound press against his chest like a hammer. His flashlight beam swept across the warehouse floor and the sight froze them in place. Row after row of iron cribs stood like cages, each holding a newborn, swaddled in thin cloth, their cries rising into a haunting chorus that filled the vast space. Some babies whimpered weakly, others wailed with desperate lungs, their tiny fists flailing against the air. Emily pressed her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "They're all here," she whispered, tears streaking down her cheeks. Jack moved quickly, scanning the room, his instincts screaming that time was short. He counted at least 24 infants, their small bodies lined in cruel order, waiting to be transported. His stomach tightened as he realized they were witnessing the heart of the operation. He turned to Clara. "Is this one of his?" he demanded. Clara's face crumpled, her voice trembling. "Yes. The brokers. They keep them here until the buyers arrive." Before Jack could respond, a shout split the air. "Intruders!" A beam of light cut across the room and armed men stepped from the shadows, their rifles raised. The cries of the babies surged higher, as if the air itself had fractured. Jack shoved Emily behind a stack of crates, raising his Glock and firing a controlled burst toward the nearest guard. The man fell with a grunt, his rifle clattering across the floor, but more poured in from the far side, their boots slamming against the concrete. The warehouse exploded into chaos. Jack moved between crates, returning fire, his body screaming in pain but his aim steady. Duke lunged at a guard who had rushed too close, his jaws clamping on the man's arm, dragging him to the ground. Emily scrambled to pull one of the cribs away from the line of fire, her small hands straining as she dragged the metal frame across the floor. Then it happened. A wiry figure with a snake tattoo curling up his neck grabbed Emily from behind, yanking her off her feet. She screamed, kicking wildly, but the man pressed a knife against her side, dragging her toward the line of crates. Jack's heart seized at the sight. His finger tightened on the trigger, but he froze. One wrong move and Emily's life would end before his eyes. The leader of the guards, a broad man with a scarred cheek, stepped forward, his voice booming. "Drop the weapon. Marine, or the girl dies." Jack's mind spun. Around him, the cries of the infants filled the air, each sound a plea he could not ignore. The man tightened his grip on Emily, pressing the blade closer. Her eyes locked on Jack's wide with terror, but also trust, as if she knew he would find a way. Jack lowered his weapon slowly, his body taut with rage, his mind calculating. If he dropped it completely, both Emily and the children would be lost. If he resisted, she would be the first to pay. The choice tore at him like shrapnel. He met the scarred man's eyes, his voice steady, though his chest burned. "Let her go, and I walk out." The man sneered, shaking his head. "No deals. You get one chance, Marine. Her or them." He gestured toward the rows of cribs, his smile cruel. Emily struggled, her small fists pounding against her captor's arm, but he held her fast. Duke barked furiously, straining against Jack's command to stay. His teeth bared, his muscles quivering to strike. Jack's breath came hard, every instinct as a soldier telling him never to surrender, every instinct as a guardian telling him never to sacrifice a child. He stood frozen in the balance, the weight of an impossible decision pressing down as the cries of innocent lives rose around him like a storm. The warehouse vibrated with the cries of the infants as the scarred guard pressed the knife closer to Emily Parker's side. Her wide eyes locked on Jack Turner, as though he were the only anchor in the storm. The choice demanded of him was impossible. Surrender the girl, or abandon the children, a decision designed to break even the strongest will. Jack's chest tightened as he weighed the options, his finger trembling over the trigger, but before he could move, Duke exploded into motion. The German shepherd surged forward with a snarl that tore through the chaos like thunder. His body was a blur of black and tan muscle as he launched himself at the tattooed man holding Emily. His jaws clamped down on the guard's arm with bone-crushing force, tearing the blade from his grasp as the man screamed and buckled under the sudden assault. Emily twisted free, stumbling onto the cold concrete, and Duke planted himself between her and the attacker. His teeth bared, his growl relentless. The moment was all Jack needed. He snapped his Glock up and fired, striking the guard squarely in the shoulder, sending him crashing backward into a row of crates. The scarred leader cursed and shouted orders, and gunfire erupted, bullets sparking off metal and shattering glass. Jack dove to shield Emily, pulling her behind a stack of crates as rounds tore into the air around them. Clara Whitmore cowered near the wall, her trembling hands clutching a fallen blanket, tears streaking her face as the infants wailed louder, the chorus of their cries piercing through the hail of bullets. Jack fired back with precise bursts, dropping another guard who had tried to flank their position. His ribs screamed in protest. His shoulder burned, but his focus was unbroken. Emily pressed close against the crate, her breath ragged, but even in her terror, her small hands moved quickly to her backpack. She pulled out a battered flip phone, the kind most would overlook as useless. Her fingers shook, but she pressed the buttons by memory, whispering into the receiver as she huddled low. "Help us. Warehouse near the rail yard. Babies everywhere." Her voice cracked, but she forced the words out, then left the line open, the sound of gunfire and infant cries spilling into the connection. Jack glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face, then gave a short nod of approval before snapping back to the fight. Emily clutched the phone against her chest, her eyes glistening with both fear and determination. Duke lunged again, driving another guard to the ground, his teeth tearing at the man's sleeve as Jack covered them with precise shots. The scarred leader snarled, his voice booming above the chaos. "You're outnumbered, Marine! You can't win!" Jack steadied his breathing, his voice calm and firm even under fire. "Maybe not, but you won't leave here with them. The guards advanced in waves, their rifles flashing, but Jack moved with the precision of a soldier who had lived through worse storms. He ducked, rolled, fired, his movements sharp, despite the agony in his chest. Emily crawled toward another crib, dragging it away from the line of fire, her small frame trembling but unyielding. She whispered to the infants, "It's okay. You'll be safe soon." Her voice breaking yet steady with a promise she refused to abandon. Clara, shaking uncontrollably, finally moved from the corner. She grabbed a heavy metal tray from the floor and swung it desperately at a guard who had crept too close. The blow staggered him just enough for Jack to finish him with a shot. Clara's face twisted with shock at her own action, but Emily gave her a quick, grateful glance before returning to shield the nearest crib. The battle raged on, bullets carving holes into the rusted walls, sparks flying as metal screamed under the impact. Duke barked fiercely, circling Emily like a sentry, his fur bristling, his teeth flashing as he lunged at anyone who dared step near. Jack's clip ran dry and he reloaded swiftly, his hand steady even as sweat and blood mingled down his face. He stole a glance at Emily and saw her knuckles white around the phone, her lips pressed tight as she whispered into the open line again, repeating their location, ensuring someone, anyone would hear. The scarred leader advanced through the chaos, his eyes locked on Jack, his own rifle raised. "This ends now," he growled, his voice cold. Jack rose from cover, meeting the man's gaze squarely, his own weapon trained. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them, the cries of infants and the thunder of gunfire fading into a single heartbeat of silence. Then both fired. The scarred man staggered back, blood blooming across his jacket, but his snarl remained, his hand gripping the rifle as he fell to one knee. Jack stepped forward, ready to finish it, but the sudden wail of sirens split the air outside, the faint red and blue lights flashing through the shattered windows. Emily's call had reached someone. Reinforcements were closing in. The guards shouted in panic, some firing wildly, others scrambling toward the exits. Jack pressed forward, his voice sharp. "Stay with me." He pulled Emily close, Duke pressing against their side, Clara stumbling after, her eyes wide with terror and disbelief. They pushed deeper into the warehouse, weaving between the cribs, shielding as many infants as they could from stray fire, the storm of violence pressing all around them. The choice Jack had been forced into still hung heavy in his chest, save Emily or save the children. But in this moment, through courage, loyalty, and sheer defiance, they had held on to both. Yet he knew the fight was far from over. The broker was still out there, his shadow stretching beyond the warehouse, and tonight was only a fracture of a much larger war. The air inside the warehouse was thick with gunpowder and the piercing cries of infants when the sound of sirens finally tore through the chaos. Red and blue lights bled across the shattered windows, their beams cutting into the dark like blades of salvation. For an instant the gunfire faltered as the guards turned their heads toward the sound, uncertainty flashing across their faces. Then the side doors burst open and Denver police stormed in with rifles raised, their voices sharp and commanding. "Drop your weapons! Hands where we can see them!" The sudden flood of authority shattered the rhythm of the traffickers. Some threw their guns down, cursing as they dropped to their knees. Others fired wildly before being struck down by precise police fire. The warehouse roared with the clash of orders, shots, and the relentless wailing of the children. Jack Turner, his shoulder slick with blood, pressed Emily Parker and Duke against a crate, shielding them as officers swept forward. His own clip was nearly spent, his body burning with exhaustion, but he lifted his Glock once more to cover a final push. Beside him, Clara Whitmore clung to the wall, her face pale, as though years of guilt weighed her into the shadows. Then Jack saw him, the scarred man, the lieutenant of the broker's ring, crawling toward a side exit behind a row of crates. His movements were desperate but deliberate, dragging his rifle along as though the fight wasn't yet finished. Jack raised his weapon, his vision blurring, but his hand trembled. Blood loss and fatigue blurred the edges of his sight, and before he could steady himself, a burst of smoke filled the air as a flash grenade clattered across the concrete. The explosion of light and sound fractured the moment, and when Jack's ears cleared, the scarred man was gone, vanished into the night through the side door. Jack's stomach twisted. The children would be saved, but the broker's shadow still stretched further than this night. The network had lost a battle, not the war. Officers rushed to the cribs, lifting infants, gently murmuring comfort through the storm. One young officer scooped a newborn into his arms, his face stricken with both relief and horror at the sight of so many small lives caught in steel cages. Emily stumbled forward, clutching the edge of a crib, tears spilling freely as she reached for a baby's hand. "They're safe now," she whispered, her voice breaking, though her eyes stayed sharp with the knowledge that the fight wasn't done. Jack staggered toward her, his knees threatening to give. His body felt heavier than steel, his shirt soaked crimson at the shoulder where the chain's wound had torn wider in the battle. Emily turned just in time to see him fall to one knee. She cried out, rushing to his side, her small hands pressing against his arm to steady him. "Stay with me," she begged, her freckles damp with tears. Jack tried to answer, but his voice was little more than a rasp. "You did good. You kept them alive." Duke circled close, pressing his massive frame against Jack's side, his growl low and steady, warning anyone who tried to pull the Marine away. Paramedics stormed into the warehouse, weaving between officers and cribs, their gurneys ready. One knelt beside Jack, reaching for his wrist. "We need to move him now," the medic barked. Emily gripped Jack's hand tighter, refusing to let go. Her small fingers wrapped around his calloused palm, holding as though her will alone could anchor him to the world. When the medics tried to lift Jack onto the stretcher, Duke snarled fiercely, teeth bared, his entire body coiled to strike. Officers froze, hands raised. "Easy, boy," one muttered, but the dog's eyes stayed locked, refusing to leave his master unguarded. Jack, half-conscious, forced his hand to brush Duke's fur weakly. "It's all right," he whispered, his words cracked but certain. Duke's growl softened, his body still tense, but his gaze steady as the medic slid Jack onto the gurney. Emily climbed beside him, never releasing his hand. When one of the officers gently tried to move her back, Duke barked sharply, his body lunging forward just enough to freeze everyone in place. "She stays," Jack rasped, his eyes barely open, but his voice carrying authority. "They're family now." The paramedics exchanged looks, then nodded, wheeling Jack toward the waiting ambulance. Emily sat at his side, her small hand still clutching his, her face set with a fierce determination that belied her years. Duke trotted alongside the stretcher, his head low, his eyes scanning every shadow, his body a shield as they moved into the night. Behind them, officers continued to lift infants from the cages, their soft cries mixing with the distant hum of police radios. Clara stood apart, her shoulders sagging, her face streaked with tears. She had spoken, she had acted, but the broker's enforcer had slipped away, and she knew the reckoning was still to come. As the ambulance doors closed, Emily leaned closer to Jack, whispering through her tears, "Don't let go. You promised." Jack, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, managed the faintest of nods. Not letting go, he murmured, before the siren wailed and the vehicle sped into the night. Duke sat pressed against Emily's legs, his amber eyes fixed ahead, his growl fading into silence, but his vow unbroken. The weeks after the raid blurred into days filled with antiseptic hallways, hushed voices, and the steady rhythm of heart monitors. Jack Turner spent that time in a hospital bed, his body stitched together from wounds that could have ended him. Yet every time his eyes opened, he saw Emily Parker curled in a chair nearby with Duke stretched protectively at her feet. Sometimes she drew in a small notepad, sketching dogs and rail cars and houses that looked like they belonged in fairy tales. Other times she simply sat, her small hand resting near his, waiting patiently, as though her presence alone kept him tethered. Duke rarely moved from his post, his amber eyes following every nurse who entered, his growl faint but present whenever strangers came too close. Clara Whitmore had been taken into custody. Her testimony recorded her fate left to the courts. Jack had not judged her, though he carried the weight of her words with him. The broker was still out there. When Jack was discharged, the city's cold spring air met him with both sharpness and renewal. Instead of returning to his empty apartment, he drove Emily and Duke to the outskirts of Denver to a modest property that had once belonged to his late uncle. The wooden house stood weathered but sturdy, its white siding faded by sun and time, its porch creaking gently as the wind brushed past. Jack paused at the door, his key heavy in his palm, then turned the handle and pushed it open. The scent of dust and pine filled the air. "This is home now," he said softly, looking down at Emily. Her eyes widened, her mouth parting slightly as she stepped across the threshold. She ran her fingers along the worn banister, her steps light as though afraid the vision might vanish if she moved too quickly. Duke bounded ahead, sniffing corners, his tail wagging slowly as if claiming the space. In the following days, the house came alive with new rhythm. Jack cooked simple meals, scrambled eggs, toast, sometimes burned bacon, but Emily ate every plate with gratitude, swinging her legs at the kitchen table while Duke sat close by, waiting patiently for scraps. In the afternoons, Emily attended a nearby school, the first she had entered in months, and returned with stories of classmates and lessons. Jack met her teacher, a woman with warm eyes who noted Emily's sharp mind and her sketches that filled the margins of every notebook. In the evenings, the three of them walked the quiet neighborhood streets, Duke's strong frame moving at their side while neighbors waved from porches. For the first time in years, Jack felt something he had long thought lost, peace carved from ordinary moments. Yet at night, shadows lingered. Jack sometimes woke drenched in sweat, memories of chains and screaming infants clawing through his sleep. Each time Duke pressed against the side of his bed, steady and silent, while Emily padded quietly into the room with her blanket curling at his side until his breath slowed again. Those fragile hours reminded him that they were bound together now, not by chance, but by survival, by promises made when steel and fire threatened to end everything. One Saturday morning, golden sunlight spilled across the porch as Jack and Emily worked to repair the old swing. He sanded the wood while she painted it a bright sky-blue streaks of color covering her hands more than the planks. Duke lounged in the yard, rolling occasionally in the grass before lifting his head to watch them with calm devotion. Emily laughed when the paint dripped onto her shoes, her voice ringing across the quiet property, and Jack found himself smiling in a way he had not in years. When the swing was done, Emily tested it immediately, her feet kicking at the air as Duke barked once in approval. The piece held, but only until the news arrived. One evening, as the sky darkened to violet, Jack sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, Emily drawing beside him, while Duke kept watch near the steps. The radio inside hummed with evening reports until a phrase cut through the calm authorities confirmed the escape of a key suspect believed to be tied to human trafficking operations across the state. The man known only by the alias The Broker remains at large. Jack's grip on the mug tightened, his jaw setting as the words settled into him like lead. Emily's pencil stilled, her eyes lifting toward him with unspoken understanding. Duke growled low, his ears pricked, his body alert as though he too understood the gravity of the moment. Jack exhaled slowly, setting the mug aside. The fight was not over. The broker had slipped through the net, his reach still stretching across the city's veins. Jack looked at Emily, her brown eyes steady despite the flicker of fear within them. He reached over, resting a calloused hand gently atop hers. "We're safe here," he said, his voice low but firm. "But the work isn't finished, and when the time comes, I won't face it alone." Emily nodded once, her small hand curling around his, her voice soft but sure. "We'll face it together." Duke rose from the porch, stepping closer, his tail flicking once like the stroke of a clock counting down. The evening settled around them, quiet, but charged with the promise of battles yet to come. Jack looked at the house, at the porch swing swaying gently in the breeze, at the child and the dog who had become his family. He knew peace could never last while the broker remained free, but for now they had carved a home, a place of warmth and light. And when the storm returned, as it surely would, they would stand against it not as broken souls, but as a family forged in fire. That was just one chapter of a story built on courage, loyalty, and the fight for what's right. But I'd like to hear from you what moment struck you the most. Was it the little girl's bravery, the Marine's determination, or the loyalty of the German Shepherd? And tell us from which city or town are you watching this story unfold. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more.